Okay. I believe it's recording. Yes. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. My name's Zan Botso. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy and director for the Center of Applied Ethics here at the University of Wisconsin-Stout. I appreciate everyone coming. Looks like we've got a great turnout for a really fun, important, interesting conversation. Let me introduce our two debaters for today. We've got Dr. Dan Demetriou, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota Morris. Dan has published on a wide range of issues in applied ethics, from AI, sex ethics, dignity, honor, and of course, the ethics of removing monuments. And we also have Dr. Travis Timmerman, who is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy at Seton Hall University. He's a researcher at Pre-Think Priorities, which is a research and implementation group aimed at making the world better with respect to a host of applied issues. He's published on the nature of grief and death, immortality, hedonism, effective altruism, and of course, the ethics of monuments. In case you're not aware, Dan and Travis have a sort of point counterpoint discussion in the book Ethics Left and Right, I believe it is, by Bob Fisher, which is a great discussion. So if you're interested in taking this further, you can look at their written work there as well. So I figure what we'll do is we'll have the debate go from 4 to 5 p.m. and we'll have maybe Travis open up with 15 minutes of opening remarks, and then Dan, we can have 15 minutes of opening remarks for you. And then we'll open it up just to a discussion between the two of you. If you have questions for one another, you can sort of raise them there and have a conversation about each opening remarks. I have questions here too, which we can go through. And then once we hit 5 p.m., we can open up to a Q&A from the audience and conclude around 5:30. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, Travis, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen here. Let's see if I can get this to work.
Perfect, yeah.
So we're gonna see that case. Okay. So I will go 15 minutes or less. I'm just going to give a quick run through of the argument that I give in that book, Ethics Left and Right. But I should note that the scope of the argument that I give in that short chapter is rather narrow. And perhaps Dan and I would be able to get into some of the more nuanced issues that fall outside the scope of the argument during the conversation. I also want to just preface this with, expressing some gratitude for having me. I've been able to talk with Dan about this a couple times over the years, and it's always been a fun, informative discussion, and I learn a lot from his work, and I'm sure today will be no different. Okay, so I'm going to just give a quick argument, the basis of which is that people who can collectively remove Confederate monuments that are public have an obligation to do so of their own volition. Right? And that's just one question. Often when you see the debate framed in media, it's sort of framed as like, are you in favor of them or not? Do you want to remove them or not? And it's sort of presumed to be an all or nothing thing. And as with almost any moral issue, when you really dig into the details, those questions will just be far too complex to give such a broad black and white answer. Okay, so the things that I'm not talking about in the argument that I'm about to give is the question of whether legally we should prohibit public Confederate monuments. I'm making a claim about what people ought to do of their own volition. I'm not making a claim, at least in this argument, about whether it ought to be legally prohibited to remove Confederate monuments. I'm not talking about whether it's morally obligatory to force the relevant group of people to remove public Confederate monuments if they refuse to do so of their own volition. Nor am I talking about whether it's morally obligatory for people to remove private Confederate monuments that might be in some club. Nor, finally, am I talking about whether it's morally obligatory to force the relevant group to remove private monuments, ones that might be on their private property. Those are all different questions. The reasons that can be said in favor of against them might overlap some, but they're going to vary as well. And we can't just have a single solution for each one of those questions, at least not plausibly. Okay, so in essence, my argument is a harm-based one. The basic idea is that the continued existence of these many public Confederate monuments result in undeserving harm. We could minimize harm by removing those without the loss of something that would be even greater if we take those monuments down. So that's the basic idea, but I formulated it in terms of a deductively valid argument. All right, so it's a little tedious to go through these, apologize, but I'm just going to go through each premise because they entail my conclusion, which means if you reject my conclusion, as a matter of logic, you have to reject at least one of the premises. Okay, so the argument can be made in two parts. The simple version is what I just gave. Here's a slightly more complicated version. The first claim is just if the existence of some monument will unavoidably harm an undeserving group, this provides strong moral reason to end the existence of that monument. Right. So the idea here is if it's harming a group that doesn't deserve to be harmed, and it's doing so unavoidably, there's not some action available to them that would prevent them from suffering the harm. It's not predicated on culpably irrational attitudes or anything like that. Then we have moral reason to end the existence of that monument. Stop short of saying that there's a moral obligation, just claims that we have some moral reason to end it. Strong moral reason. Okay. Second claim, public Confederate monuments unavoidably harm an undeserving group, which include at least those who suffer as a result of knowing the racist motivation behind the existence of most Confederate monuments, or as a result of having the horrors of the Civil War and the United States racist history made salient when they see public Confederate monuments. So we had the protest in Charlottesville a few years ago. There was a bunch of media coverage about the motivation behind erecting or rededicating a number of public Confederate monuments. And those motivations were often, as you can imagine, not good in nature. People knowing that and then seeing public Confederate monuments, I want to claim is a harm to them. But even people unaware of that fact could be harmed in a way that's analogous to being harmed when you see anyone revisiting or doing something that generates shock value for some horrible event. So I use an example of these punk rockers from the 1970s that used to wear swastikas, not because they had any sympathies with Nazis at all, but indeed they were doing it for shock value, largely. It's more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. And they were doing this at a time when there were a number of people who had survived the Holocaust and would see that. And I want to claim that's harmful for them, even if they know that the motivation of the punk rockers wearing the swastika was not anti-Semitic in nature. Okay, so that's the second premise. Those two premises entail the conclusion that there's strong moral reason to remove public Confederate monuments. That still stops short of generating an obligation. So it's just those two premises entail that conclusion. But I want to argue that we have a moral obligation to remove public Confederate monuments of our own volition, at least those of us that are in a position as a group to do so. Okay. Fourth premise says if there's strong moral reason to remove public Confederate monuments, then absent equally strong or stronger countervailing reasons to preserve them, people are morally obligated to, of their own volition, remove them. That sounds like word salad, but the basic idea is just a claim about the way that reasons work. If you have strong moral reason to do something, then unless you have at least a strong moral reason to do something else, you have to do what the strong moral reason says you have to do. The fifth premise, that's the one where I think there will be a lot of disagreement, a lot of pushback. That's the claim that there's no countervailing reasons to preserve public Confederate monuments that are equally strong or stronger than the moral reasons to preserve them. So that's the claim that even if you grant that public Confederate monuments can cause unnecessary harm to undeserving people, there's no other considerations in favor of keeping them up that's basically more important, to put it loosely, than the considerations in favor of taking them down. Okay, so 1 and 2 entail 3, and then 3, 4, and 5 are going to entail 6, the conclusion that people are morally obligated to, of their own volition, remove public Confederate monuments. Okay, so that gives me 6 minutes more. I'm going to run through a couple of objections and responses to premise 5. I won't go through them in much detail, but it might be helpful to see how I'd respond to those if we want to talk about them further in the Q&A, though we could talk about other things completely. Okay, so one thing that a lot of people say is, well, look, there'd be a great deal of historical or aesthetic significance that would be lost if we took down public Confederate monuments. I'm personally skeptical that anything could have historical value in any sense that we should care about, at least if the historical value itself doesn't make a difference to people's well-being. But the more important thing is that I'm understanding the term monuments to be a sort of endorsement of the person or people that it's depicting, or even thing that it's depicting. And those monuments could be put in museums, for instance, or have some other sort of context added to them that, in my mind, would prevent them from being accurately categorized as monuments, but nevertheless preserve whatever historical or aesthetic value that they supposedly have. Now, maybe I'm using the term monument in an idiosyncratic way. Some people have pushed against that in the literature. So I'm not sure what to think about that. But the argument that I'm making, however we want to define our terminology, would allow for the preservation of the monuments themselves, just not as monuments. Okay. I think those are the most important points in light of that. The other is erasing history. I'm skeptical that monuments impart much knowledge about history, but even if they do, in fact, do that, then we could prevent that from happening by removing the monument and erecting some other museum-like historical artifact that would provide relevant historical details that matter to people. Okay. Selective honor. So you might say, look, we can preserve the Confederate monuments and only honor them for the good things that they did. And I think that's true, actually. I mean, in the same way that we can give Academy Awards to directors and writers and actors and editors and so forth, they all have deep moral flaws without in any way endorsing the bad things that they've done, but instead honoring them specifically for their contribution to some film that year. We could likewise honor Confederate monuments for whatever's noble about the Confederate generals or soldiers in question. Okay. My response to that, though, is that it's unlikely to be what would at least exclusively happen in the case of Confederate monuments, given the way that it's polarized now. And even if we could do that, it would still generate harm. And I think the prevention of harm is more important in this case than whatever good would come from selectively honoring them. And then last objection that I'll consider with the time that I have left, because I want to stay within the time that's given to me. You might run the harm argument both ways. So thus far, I focused on how removing Confederate monuments or how preserving them can harm a group that doesn't deserve to be harmed in a way that's unavoidable. Right? But I might say, look, there's lots of preservationists that want to keep the monuments up, and taking them down will harm them. They'll be angry about that. Okay, so one thing I want to say about that is that is less likely to happen for an extended period of time than if we preserve them. But the other thing is, I don't want to just give a kind of simple utilitarian argument that says we should just maximize overall, hedonic welfare or preference satisfaction, or take a vote and figure out what people want. I want to discount harm that's predicated on irrational attitudes or bigoted beliefs that people are culpable for having. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think every preservationist, even maybe most, I don't know, this is an empirical question, not saying that they have bigoted beliefs or have culpably irrational attitudes. But when we saw the Charlottesville protests and the people being interviewed there who wanted to preserve them, and a lot of people that make noise about it now, certainly a non-trivial amount. And they would be distraught if we took the monuments down. That could cause them harm. At least with respect to that type of harm, I'd want to discount for that and say we don't have to take that into account in our moral deliberation. Okay, I think I've gone on long enough. So I'll say this one last thing and then I'll shut up and hand it over to Dan. Last thing you might say is, look, this would just prove too much. It would mean we'd have to remove every single monument because everybody is deeply morally flawed. My thought is the harm-based argument is not going to apply to all arguments. There's some people that are deeply morally flawed and we can valorize them in a selective way, and nobody seems to care about that for a variety of contingent social facts. And in that case, I'm totally fine honoring someone that has done something really evil if honoring them or keeping the monument up is not going to cause further harm. Whereas in the case of Confederate monuments, I think that it probably does. So I take that to be a relevant difference. So I'm not appealing to the moral character of a person, the flawed moral character itself, as a reason to remove monuments. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and hand it over to Dan.
Thanks so much, Travis. You're up, Dan. Thanks.
Okay, everyone. Thanks very much for having me, Zan, and thank you, Travis, for having this conversation with me. Travis is kind of unquestionably one of the best young philosophers out there, I think, and it's always a pleasure to talk to him about whatever we have occasion to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, do you see that? Okay, so I figured, like, I'm structuring this as a bunch of in the form of like what I call removalist fallacies. I think it's going to be the most efficient way of causing trouble here and confusing things and making people less sure about what they think they're sure about. Unless this is more of a negative approach as opposed to giving my positive view, but we could talk about positive positions I take later. So just for the sake of everyone knowing what I mean by fallacy, fallacy is just kind of an unreliable inference. Doesn't mean it's a wrong inference. It's an unreliable form of thinking. Here's an uncontroversial type of fallacy. The fallacy of composition. What's true of the parts must be true of the whole. Like, well, if the bricks in the wall are sturdy, the brick wall must be sturdy, right? And well, obviously that's not the case, right? So that's just an example of a fallacy. So let's talk about some what I think to be unreliable inferences that removalists make. Okay, so removalist is someone who thinks we should take down, in this case, racist monuments. Travis is more focused on Confederate monuments. I'm going to be more focused on racist monuments, which kind of ties into colonialist monuments, which ties into the whole decolonialist movement. Now, again, these inferences might be true in some cases, okay? Even the fallacies that I'm talking about might be true in some cases, all right? So, like these positions might be correct. However, are they applied consistently by removalists? I think no, right? So I think removalists, if they're going to bite some of these bullets, need to accept some consequences that they may not like. So that's what I'm going to try to show. And I'm not saying that Travis subscribes to all of these or even any of these. In fact, I know he doesn't subscribe to at least some of them. Okay, so one we could call the containment fallacy, which says, look, we're just talking about Confederate monuments. We just want to take down Confederate monuments, okay? Or we're just talking about racist monuments. We just want to take down racist monuments, okay? You know, and sometimes it's very implicit. People aren't saying that saying this explicitly, that it's going to end here, But you know, in a lot of the discussions, it's implied that, well, you know, yeah, it'll stop here. Once we do this, we're content. You know, but there's no real reason to think that's the case, right? So monuments to founders are being taken down who were not Confederates. Monuments to, like, here's a monument to, like, Grant was taken down. Monuments to Churchill are being you know, are in play. The wider decolonialist movement, the movement to take down Confederate monuments is really part of a decolonialist movement that started in South Africa in 2015. And so a whole lot of monuments are under threat, okay? And that's as it kind of should be. I mean, if you're consistent about it, because this, whatever reason you have to take down a Confederate monument will apply, I think, to the founders, right? It's not as if, like, I mean, even if you're focused on racism or colonialism, I mean, if you're focused on racism, well, okay, well, weren't the founding fathers racists in the sense of, you know, they were, you know, conquering a whole, you know, continent, okay? So all of those would have to be taken down for the same reasons. And it isn't as if racism is the only evil in the world. I mean, I know there's like this what I consider to be a preoccupation with racism right now as a great evil, but you know, there are other evils in the world like sexism. So like, should we take down sexist statue? Well, show me a statue of someone who wasn't sexist or homophobic or transphobic. I mean, I'm sure Martin Luther King was homophobic, transphobic, etc. Would his statue have to become? I talked to, you know, Travis was in the audience when I gave a presentation a couple years ago, and someone in the audience said that, you know, she thinks, a professor said that she thinks like statues to pretty much everyone needs to be taken down because they were all meat eaters. Okay, so I mean, you know, there's other evils in the world, and people will be concerned about those things next. So we have to really think about the consequences of this. All right, the next fallacy we'll call the moralism fallacy, which says, look, if a monument is to an immoral person or to an immoral event, then it should be taken down. Travis is explicitly not a moralist about monuments, nor am I. Travis and I are both what I would call offense theorists. So we think it's offense that matters. Travis and I disagree about whose offense matters. But you know, like if you're a moralist about, if you think like racist monuments should be taken down because, you know, Lee was a racist or immoral, then, you know, like you got to consider all these sorts of statues around the world to like deeply evil people, like Genghis Khan. Mongolia is throwing up Genghis Khan monuments all over the place. There's monuments to Tamerlane, who killed millions. There's monuments to Shaka Zulu going up. No one's complaining about this. Shaka Zulu was a colonist par excellence, a genocider. You know, so like no one's complaining about those. Those would all have to go. I don't think they should have to go. George Floyd was not a good person. I'm sorry to tell you this. Like, I mean, right there, it's not like he did anything great for the world, and he was an armed robber. There's no reason to put him up if moralism is a concern. But I think George Floyd monuments should stay up if the people care about them, and it's an expression of like the trauma of a people. But they would have to be taken down if you're a moralist about monuments. Another fallacy that you'll hear is like it seems like people think like if you can't interpret a monument as racist, then it should be taken down. But you know, monuments have many interpretations. Okay, like look, you know, don't forget this duck-rabbit illusion, right? You know, you could look at it and see a duck, you could look at it and see a rabbit, and people look at monuments and they interpret different things from monuments, and sometimes the interpretations are dumb. Like if I were looking at this Buddha statue, this is a statue of Buddha in Hong Kong, right? It has a swastika on it. It's an important religious symbol in the East and good luck symbol. Okay, it has nothing to do with Nazism, but if someone's like, oh, it's a Nazi statue, like they'd just be making a mistake. University of Wisconsin-Madison took down this rock that like nobody associated with racism, but someone found that in 1920s, someone called it an N-word head because they called all black rocks N-word heads at that time. And so in some student newspaper, it was referred to as an N-word head in 1920, like literally not mentioned since then. Someone dug that up and they spent like hundreds of thousands of dollars removing this Chamberlain rock. And so, you know, some people look at Confederate monuments, many of whom are black, and think that they're meant to honor Confederates, and some people think that they're meant to glorify the Confederacy. And, you know, the question should be like, okay, if they have two reasonable, I think these are two reasonable interpretations, why do we respond to the racist interpretation and not the non-racist interpretation? Okay, another fallacy we could call the fallacy of universalism, which is that monuments should be for everyone, right? Like there shouldn't be monuments to, say, only one, you know, people of like one race or ethnicity or one subpopulation of the country, or certainly not a monument to people who fought against the country or, you know, fought for something that was, you know, against the country's values or against sort of liberal values or something like that. Mitch Landrieu, you know, is an exemplar of this sort of argument, but it's just not consistently applied. We do have monuments to just some populations all over the place. Like my favorite one, and I mean favorite in every sense because I think it's a great monument, is a recent monument to the Native Americans who fought at Little Bighorn and slaughtered the American, what is the 7th Cavalry or something like that at Little Bighorn. Okay, so this is on the Little Bighorn battlefield. It's commemorating the Indians. By the way, they were fighting Americans, so it can't be that it's like bad to memorialize people who fought Americans. It can't. They were not fighting for liberal values. They were fighting for their ethno-state. Okay, so it can't be bad to fight for an ethno-state. So it's just like, what's going on here? We're not being consistent about it. And I think it's good. I think that monument should be up, right? Because I'm okay with monuments. I'm what I would call a particularist. I'm okay with monuments being for some people. Crazy Horse Memorial, great memorial being made, right? Obviously, not made for all Americans. It's made to commemorate some Americans and important to some Americans. All right, so I mean, I'm going to end here. I guess I went through that kind of fast, but there are alternative positions for all of these things. You know. You don't have to be a moralist. You could think about monuments in terms of like how you decorate your house or how you commemorate in your house. Okay, and that's what I think what monuments do. They're sort of like a nation's walls that they hang pictures up on, or a nation's mantle that they put mantelpieces on. Okay, and you're not really moralistic. You're not like, oh, was my uncle a good enough person to hang on this wall or something like that. So you don't have to be that. You don't have to be a universalist. You could be a particularist about monuments and be okay with monuments that are for some population. In this case, maybe in the case of Confederates, maybe, you know, white Southerners. You don't have to think that, oh, if there's one interpretation that's racist, then it has to go down. You could say, look, if there's multiple interpretations, one of which is positive, one of which is negative, then we have to have a discussion about, you know, should we be interpreting it in the positive way, etc. All right. So there, if you want to learn more about my view, and this may come up in the Q&A, you could watch that video online, another discussion I had, and some other pieces of my work. But other than that, I'm ready to just launch into Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'd love to hear a little more from both of you exchanging. I don't know, Travis, if you had any thoughts come up in light of Dan's presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I agree with him that those are fallacies and don't endorse any of those. I guess I would, maybe the only qualification I would make about my view in relation to his was he described both of us as like offense theorists. And I think I'm maybe more broadly concerned with the category of harm, where I think of offense as maybe like a type of harm. I don't know if that's going to result in any substantive differences down the line. It might be inconsequential, but I wanted to just flag that because that might be one sort of area where we have a disagreement that could have consequences that I'm just not recognizing right now. But other than that, even though we sort of come down on different sides about what should happen to Confederate monuments, we agree about these fallacies, and there's various overlaps in the moral presuppositions that are operating in the background when we approach this question.
Great, thanks. And Dan, any responses to Travis here?
Yeah, I think if the audience wants to know, well, where do Dan and Travis disagree? I think on his premise one, when Travis is worried about harm to an undeserving group, I do disagree with that premise. I think that it's okay to have monuments that will offend or irritate and harm, therefore, people, undeserving people. Like take the Genghis Khan monument. I'm sure it irritates and offends a lot of Chinese people because Genghis Khan killed like 50 million of them. It's, you know, and so it probably irritates them. If they're really irritated, then it harms them or whatever, you know. And in a sense, they're undeserved. It's undeserved harm. It's not like they have it coming or something like that, right? But I don't think that weighs against the Genghis Khan monument, because I think that for undeserved harm of a monument to morally matter, the people who are the harmed parties need to have some claim against whoever raised the monument not to be harmed. So like, you know, like if I put up a picture on my wall that offends you, okay, my house, right, that offends you. And like, let's say I have, you know, I have a party, you come, you see this picture on my wall, you're offended. Okay, you know, that's undeserved harm. But I don't think you have a claim against me not to be harmed by that picture I put up on my wall. And likewise, I think that the Chinese don't have a claim against the Mongolians not to be offended by or harmed by the Genghis Khan monument. That's an easy case, I think, right? Much harder is the question about, you know, Black Americans and Civil War statues, right? Because they, you know, for me at least, it's a tougher case because I'm sort of a nationalist about monuments, right? And so Blacks are co-nationals with whites and Southern whites, and so they, you know, there is a claim to be made by them not to be harmed by those monuments. So, but you know, there's a lot of nuances there. So that's one place that Travis and I disagree. And again, the outweighing thing, the premise 5. You know, I think that probably the right thing to do is what Mandela did after taking over South Africa. When South Africa democratized, a lot of people thought that Mandela would allow or indeed spearhead the total removal of Afrikaner monuments. And he didn't. He wanted them up. And so the question is, well, why even today can you see all these Afrikaner monuments up that are, you know, sometimes, you know, pretty great? Like if you go to the Voortrekker monument, you know, what's going on here? Why are they still up? And you know, what I think is Mandela's answer is my answer, which is that it's okay within certain sort of parameters that I talk about if we have more time to talk about it, but it's okay within certain parameters to have monuments to people who are culture heroes to just part of your population, and who were even against the unification of that population with another part of the population. And so what we need to do is just be okay with that. One analogy for that would be like, suppose that you're in an interracial marriage and your grandparents were against your getting married to this Black person or whatever. And suppose that your Black wife or husband was against, you know, him or her marrying, you know, you, if you're white. You know, should you not have pictures on their wall? And I think you should still have pictures on their wall. You know, my wife's grandmother probably would be appalled that she married me. But, you know, I have her picture on the wall. And I want my kids to love her and respect her and honor her and feel good about their ancestry, right? So on both sides. And I think that's how that's kind of the approach that we need to have in a multiracial society, because the alternatives, I think, are worse than taking them down.
Thanks, Dan. So I guess one question I have, and then we can open up to everybody else too. We're all philosophers, so I was telling Dan earlier that part of my research is on David Hume. So Hume has kind of come under the crosshairs recently. Travis, I'd be curious to know how you would handle this particular case, because I know you're saying that it's not people who have moral flaws per se that you're opposed to, or you're supporting taking down monuments just on those grounds. Here you have David Hume, who's obviously one of the most famous Enlightenment philosophers, but has this notoriously racist footnote, which unequivocally is racist, awful footnote. And over at Edinburgh University, I'm sure you're familiar with, there's a statue for Hume, which I think is still standing, but there was this Hume Tower, this building on campus, which was recently renamed. So how would you approach that particular case? Do you think that there's sufficient harm in those sort of situations where maybe the statue of Hume should come down? And I'd be curious to hear, Dan, how you would handle that case as well. I mean, I assume I know how you would handle that case, but I'd love to hear you talk about it. Oh, you're still muted too, Travis.
Sorry about that. I'll say a few quick things about that. So one, Julian Baggini, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, wrote an intellectual biography of Hume that came out with Princeton University Press this last year. And he talks about that case in one of the chapters. And I think, one, that book is really good and it's meant for public audience. So it's a nice, easy read for anyone that's interested in philosophy. And he does a nice job of contextualizing that footnote in Hume and how it's intellectually distinct from his broader thought, and he does so with a level of historical knowledge that I do not have and thus would be unable to replicate here. So the first thing I would say is, like, read his book. It was really good and he does a nice job discussing that case, but I also learned a lot of interesting stuff about Hume as a person. I already knew about his philosophy. Right? The second thing is, I would want to approach this in the same way. So I know that's gotten some press. I'd heard about it before I had read about this in the book. But most people, I presume, read that, think, oh, if he was a terrible person, he was a racist, we should just remove the monument, and they're, a little miffed about it, and then they move on with their lives and they never think about it again. So the people that are the ones that would be, seeing this on a daily basis, which would be the students at the University of Edinburgh. They're the ones that'll have, David Hume sort of salient in their mind when they're crossing his statue, when they're going to the classes. And I said, want to know, like, do they care? What do they think? Survey them. If there's enough of an outcry, taken down. But I suspect in this case that most students don't care, and most students probably don't even know who he is. So that's what I suspect, but I can't do that from the armchair. It's really an empirical question, the extent to which this is harmful. The last thing I'll say is, in some of the coverage of that, there were suggestions that we should not teach Hume in philosophy courses. And that's something that I would be deeply opposed to. Right. So I don't think much hangs on the monument. I don't think there's a lot of significant value in a Hume monument. I don't think students care, most likely now. And if you take it down, I don't think most students will care. They'll get some press and then they'll all move on with their lives. And the students that enroll in the University of Edinburgh afterwards, where it was never there, they're not going to care about that. But there was a significant loss if you refrain from teaching important historical philosophers because of their moral flaws. I'm totally fine and would encourage people to contextualize Hume's thought in the way that Baggini does in that book. I'm not saying that you should ignore his moral shortcomings, but you'd miss out on a lot if you don't get to learn about Hume's thought and the way that it influenced philosophy. You'll miss out on history. One last thing, and then I really will shut up for sure and hand it over to Dan, is I think, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that monuments are honorific in nature. We shouldn't conceive of teaching philosopher, though, as an endorsement or honoring them necessarily. I mean, they might be, maybe it's honoring someone to say that they're historically significant in some way. I'm not sure that that's actually true or not. But even if it is going to endorse that component of them, it needn't, of course, involve endorsing the moral shortcomings and teaching about the moral shortcomings. If it's going to affect them at all, it's going to affect them negatively. Although my view is like, once you're dead, no one benefits from being remembered after they're dead, and no one's going to be harmed from being spoken about poorly after they're dead. So I don't hold the view that like it's good for people, they benefit from being memorialized or talked about in classes once they're dead and gone. Same for the converse benefit as well. Okay, now I really will stop.
Thanks, Travis. I don't know if Dan, if you had anything you wanted to add to that. Otherwise, I've got some other questions here.
Yeah, I mean, I would not change. I would not remove Hume's name or statue from anything. So a few points. Just as people might forget about it if you take it down, which I disagree. I think the case can be made that students will forget about it if you just leave it up. I mean, students weren't all this stuff was out there. No one was exercised about it. It got a lot of press in this moment of, racial, this epoch of anti-racism. But if you just refuse to listen to students who complain, like they'll just move on to the next thing next year. It'll be just some other cause du jour, and they'll be okay with it again. And you get to maintain your cultural continuity and so forth. I think that it is really important that it isn't like why should you take Hume's name down? Did he have different views than anybody else that is being remembered? And it's just because he wrote it down that like we have to go after him. He was probably more. He was probably less. Had less racial animosity than the typical person of his age or whatever. And I do think it is really important to remember, and to have a culture, okay, that remembers greats from the past and honors the greats of your institution and your land and so forth. It'd be a sad thing if anti-racism required just repudiating your entire culture. And in doing so, you would just be repudiating the whole reason that anyone of any other race would even go there in the first place. So people make sacrifices for honor. People make sacrifices for their memory. And, if like, why would I, make some endowment to a university if people are going to repudiate me and call me bad names 10 years after I die or something like that? And, so why would, like in Oxford or in Cape Town, why would Rhodes make those sacrifices or give all that land to University of Cape Town and so forth if he was going to have his name dragged through the mud? He wouldn't. And you could see where that's going, like rich people now who want to make sacrifices, or heroes who could make sacrifices now, if they're just going to be lumped in as like, why would I jump off of a ship to fight the Nazis into withering fire from Nazis if I'm going to be called a Nazi by the people, by the descendants of the country that I'm trying to save 50 years later? You're not going to get people to make that sacrifice, right? So it really is important to honor people who do great things for your culture. And I think we're headed down a very dangerous path that will lead to a very low trust, selfish society where people are just looking out for theirs, interested only in making money, and rather than making sacrifices for collectives. That's a very serious problem, in my opinion.
Thanks, Dan. I have one more question I'll throw out there, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. And if people want to raise their hand when we get to that stage, I'll try to call on as many people as we can in the order that you raise your hand. So this one's for Dan. Dan, I'm wondering, It's just occurred to me hearing you talk. I'm wondering what your thoughts would be on this. Uh, do you think there are any monuments that shouldn't be put up? Right? Is there any sort of monument that is of a certain character, of a certain individual that shouldn't be put up? And I'm wondering whether or not, if the answer to that is yes, if that would have any implications for whether or not there should be some monuments that should come down. Again, just occurred to me now, but what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I do try to be symmetrical on that to some degree, but there is like people do get a lot of emotional investment in something that's already up. That's a real thing. Fait accompli, But so I have what I call a tribal loyalty standard. So a monument should not go up, and to some degree, a monument should not stay up if it betrays this tribal loyalty standard. If the only reasonable interpretation of that monument are ones that are offensive to your tribe mates, so then I think it should go down. And that, by the way, again, is not moralistic. So like, suppose I have like an ex-girlfriend who's like a really good person. She's like, she like gave a kidney to a stranger, and she like does all this good stuff, donates all this money to charity. And I'm like, tell my wife, I'm going to put up this picture to my ex-girlfriend, honey, like I shouldn't do that, right? And it's not because she's a bad person, but because it would fail to show appropriate respect and tribal loyalty to someone who does have a claim against me, should not be disrespected in her own home, right? And likewise, right? So if there's and it's hard to like understand, like, why, what other interpretation for that monument would there be? So it's not like I'm putting up philanthropists generally in my household, etc. So yeah, like, so if there's a monument, like, so for instance, the Battle of Liberty Place monument that used to be in New Orleans, it was pretty much explicitly, insofar as it actually had this inscribed on the monument at one point, and they took that inscription down in the 30s, by the way. But it was explicitly put up to like bemoan the failure of a basically Southern coup after the Civil War on Louisiana, in Louisiana, okay? And it said right on there, like, this will, white supremacy, it's used the word white supremacy will never be defeated or something like that. You guys can look it up. I talk about it. I don't have the slide with me. Battle of Liberty Place, if any fact checkers out there want to see that inscription. Now that one, to me, like, that has only one reasonable interpretation. It's not like, it's like not really, it doesn't have this, okay, we're just, we're honoring Lee's, heroism for, his people in Virginia or whatever, and it only has this negative interpretation, this disqualifying interpretation, I would put it. Doesn't really have a qualifying interpretation. Yeah, that's one that I think should have gone. But so yeah, that would be an example. Or a Hitler statue in Germany. But again, that would be, again, not because Hitler is immoral, because I'm not opposed to the Genghis Khan statues in Mongolia. It would be because it would be too unambiguously insulting to Jewish Germans. Okay, not to Jews worldwide, again, because Jews worldwide have no claim to Germany's, heritage landscape, in my opinion. But for Jewish Germans, right? So, so something like that. Yeah, this tribal loyalty standard.
Yeah, so it seems like then I want to go back to Travis here for a minute, but I'll open up to Q&A. But what you were just saying there, Dan, seems an awful lot like what Travis was saying before about how if the statue of Hitler is causing suffering to German Jews, I mean, suppose, for instance, that Hitler won the war, and yet some Jews survive in Nazi Germany. Would that statue constitute being part of that tribal identity for Germans at the time, such that if the statue does go up, even though it causes this kind of suffering to the Jewish community there, would that not be sufficient reason to bring it down? Anyways, those are my thoughts. You don't necessarily have to answer it because I want to open it up to the Q&A here. But Dan, I'll let you answer that. But others in the chat here, if you want to throw in your questions or raise your hand, and we'll open it up to the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, we could open up to Q&A, but it's yeah. So if you this becomes very interesting in like what to do with what do you. It has a lot to do with whether or not you want to keep, whether you want to be tribe mates. Like you have to think about whether or not you want to be tribe mates with the people you're offending. Like I don't think everyone gets to decide. Like whether or not someone's a tribe mate with you is a two-way street. Both groups have to agree. And if one group just does not want to be tribe mates, then things get very interesting very fast. Like, so for instance, like, should Indians not put up statues to heroes of the Indian independence movement who fought against English, if there's still English people living in India? It isn't obvious at all to me that they should not put up those statues, right? Because they don't want to be, if they want the English out, then what they're saying is like, we're going to decorate this house in a way that knowingly offends you, and because we don't want you as tribe mates, okay? So it isn't the case that just one group gets to unilaterally decide that they are, right. They have to be they have to want to be tribe mates, like in the marriage, right. They both groups have to want to be together. So I don't want to give this hard and fast rule that just because someone's in your nation, you should someone's within your borders or something like that you shouldn't put up stuff. You shouldn't put up monuments that antagonize, because you might not want them there. So if the Nazis won the war and put up a Hitler statue, I'm going to interpret this as, boy, they really don't want to be tribe mates with Jews. And that's the real question then, right? The question isn't like, oh, well, why do you have that monument up? The real issue is, well, are you or are you not going to be in this country? And like, are you guys going to be tribe mates or not? Because that's what's at stake here. It's not the monuments. The monuments are an expression of the desire of the people to live together. Okay, but I can't on the same token, right? I can't just be claiming that all of your decorations that you put up in the house of your ancestors are offensive to me, and you have to take them down, and you have to just be like, oh, well, I guess I mean, if my wife started pulling that with me, honestly, I'd want a divorce, right? I mean, right. And so likewise, if one group of Americans said, oh, you got to take down all your monuments because they're offensive to me, then it's like, well, let's have a national divorce then. Because obviously you don't, you can't tolerate me and my people, right? It's unless like being married to you is so worth it, that disavowing my heritage and my people is worth it. I can't imagine that being ever worth it. But if that's the calculus, then okay.
Well, I want to thank Dan and Travis. Let's go to Cynthia.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, okay. I am very excited about this debate. I teach a class called Art and Controversy, so I'm an art historian here on campus. So thank you both for coming here. I think this is a great discussion. So I just have a question for Dan about public spaces. So just in terms within the framework of Confederate monuments, when you have a Confederate monument in a public space, what would your response be about that forced confrontation that the person, let's say, someone with African American heritage is getting confronted with that every single day, and it erodes away perhaps at their sense of tribalism within the country. So I'm just wondering what your response would be about specifically public spaces and that encountering on a daily basis. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Well, all the monuments, I mean, what makes this interesting is that they're in public spaces to me. So the analogy I'd want to draw is like, well, how a husband, I mean, how a married couple would decorate the common spaces, you know, the living room and so forth, the dining room. Obviously your kids like have some prerogative about how they decorate their rooms, right? And you give them more like, you give them more freedom about decorating their rooms within limits. But the living room is different, the dining room is different. It has to be something that is kind of there. I think the morality requires us to think about it being acceptable to everybody there, and so forth. So Black Americans confronted with Confederate statues, although there aren't many up left anymore. Native Americans being confronted with every single founder statue, right? Mount Rushmore and everything else. If the heritage landscape is the nation's walls and mantelpieces, the way they decorate, the way they terraform a land to make it not just a place where they live and do business. It's not a shopping mall. It's a home, in my view, right? So I'm very nationalistic about this. It has a character, right? I'm not just putting up a fern and an abstract art because I'm not running a mall, right? We're running a country with a people, with a character and artistic verve and and expression. I'm not liberal in that way, right? So it's not just an economic trading zone. It's a nation with a country, which is the territory of a nation, in my view, right? So yeah, then you have to be, then we have to be okay with what we're putting up within some limits. I gave my view of what those limits should be. If I'm very easily offended, if you have a very low tolerance for monuments going up to people who you don't like or who were against you, then you're going to have a hard time unless you live in a country where everyone has your culture, or your national background or your racial background or whatever. So if you have a very low tolerance for this, then I guess that's pushing you more for like ethno-states. If you want a multiracial society that has richness and character and expression, then you have to have a high tolerance for monuments going up to people who hated you and would despair if they saw what the country became. And that's exactly what South Africa has done. It lasted for a while. I don't know if it's going to continue. I'm not optimistic about where South Africa is headed, but that was the philosophy of Mandela and South Africa, I think. And I don't know if you have anything to say about South African monuments, but I think they did really interesting stuff in the last couple decades. So I think it is possible, but it's hard.
And then Ava, I saw you had your hand up. Did you? Okay, there you go. Yes, go ahead, Ava.
Hi. Yeah, I had a question about what both of you might say to someone who wants to keep monuments up, but in the future, when developing new monuments or deciding what to place in, the next big area that we want to like put a monument in, like a new standard for recognizing that, like, okay, if we're seeing monuments as this wall piece, as this way that we decorate to show like what we want to represent as a country, as a people. Unity has to be the emphasis on the next statue. The oneness, the togetherness, the we're all in this together, like new standards for what we want in place if we're gonna be a nation of multi-tribes. Like, what would you say to someone who's like, all right, new standards when we're replacing old memorials that, you know, venerate people that were no longer in our consciousness anymore? What do we think about new standards for memorials?
I don't know if Travis wants to take that.
I'll just say quickly that, I mean, I'm in favor of that. I think it meshes well with my harm-based account. So if adding other monuments is going to improve overall well-being, that's not, you know, undeserved and doesn't result in more unavoidable harm, then that's great. I mean, if you walk around like Central Park in New York, there's this area that's just a row of various statues. You have like Christopher Columbus to Balto to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And it sort of is like that. It's just the one, and they've been adding ones over the years, seemingly with that goal in mind. I can't say that for sure because the press around it doesn't specify the motivation, but that seems to be sort of underlying it. And it seems to work well. And insofar as it works well, I'm totally in favor of that. I mean, I say that, and the only qualification is there's a sort of nagging thing in the background that I also think in many cases people don't care, or they don't care for more than like the few minutes that they look at that statue and then move on with their lives. So it's sort of hard to measure the overall impact on well-being for any of these things. But it looks like it moves the needle a little bit, and insofar as it does, I would support it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a moderate, I guess, on this. I think that it's okay to have monuments that are explicitly for a group, even going forward. Even kind of a political group, like my politics don't align with whoever put up those George Floyd monuments. So do those like monuments help unite us? I don't know that they do. But they're it's okay, I think, to have monuments that are for a subgroup. And in this case, this would be a political group. And as long as the monuments are not you know, trying to be offensive, not trying to stick a thumb in your eye. Now, when I showed a picture of the George Floyd monuments, one was just a bust, one was him sitting on a bench with his arm out. Just not, it's not really provocative. It's not, you know, really kind of, you know, digging in, you know, like, or like the Indian monuments, you know, they're showing the Native American warrior, the spirit warrior monument, the crazy horse, you know, they're showing them in this noble pose. We know they were fighting the American army. We know they killed them, slaughtered them. We know they cut their genitals off and shoved them in the mouth. They don't put that in, right, wisely, because, right, that would be too much, right? So, but we know what's going on. So I don't know, I'm okay with it. I don't know that like a crazy horse monument, which is still being made, is that about unity or help unifying us? I don't see that. It may be indirectly helping to unify us by saying, look, there's part of the American story that's not being told. There's a part of the American, there's a population of Americans whose heroes are not honored in this land. There are pictures of people in this family there are no pictures of their ancestors on the wall. We have to make sure we have to get some on the wall. In that way, it does build unity, because it's like, look, I'm represented in the national landscape. That's important. And so in that way, I think it builds unity. But just the monument, like in isolation, like if you're just forgetting about all that stuff, it isn't necessarily like, celebrating the unity of America to show Native Americans, fighting, the Native American cavalry fighting or something like that. So.
Yeah, so it sounds like maintaining just a robust like variety of monuments for different people, as long as they're tasteful, like it sounds pretty unifying to me. I don't know, guys, did we solve racist monuments? Is this the solution?
Well, yeah. So what people are offended by is, I think aesthetics matter a lot. Unfortunately, aesthetic standards change too. Like, so, like the first slide I had up of in my presentation today was, Lincoln standing over this kneeling slave, the Emancipation Monument statue, and that is still up in DC. A copy, I think, in Baltimore was taken down, or somewhere else. They're in play. Like, I think the original statue was actually paid for by Black subscribers. So a bunch of freed Blacks, I think, put together the money for this monument. And the monument aesthetically was riffing off an abolitionist pamphlet. And it wasn't viewed as that offensive at the time, obviously, although Douglas did write a little piece about he didn't like the pose. But nowadays, more and more people are looking at this, and it looks like, oh, this is white savior complex and so forth, and it's offensive. So yeah, even something that was at one time, is supposed to be positive, the aesthetics could change, or our standards could change, and it could be viewed as antagonistic.
Yes, go ahead, Ellen. Maybe not. Ellen, do you have a question, or?
No, I accidentally pushed it. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine. No worries. Any other questions? I've got some thoughts here, but any other questions? So, I mean, Dan, I was thinking about your analogy with the house. I'm thinking of the question, right? Should we remove racist monuments? What exactly are we asking, right? Are we asking a moral question? Are we asking a legal question? It seems like these can easily get fuzzy and sort of blend into one another. And if you take this sort of the husband-wife case, which you have of the husband hanging up the picture that offends, say, his wife or causes her suffering. If I were to ask, should he take it down because it causes her suffering? The answer would seem to be yes, right? From an ethical perspective, right? He should take it down. But I'm wondering if that particular analogy isn't the apt one, right? Because husbands and wives and spouses have certain obligations, presumably, to one another. And so that might cloud our judgment, perhaps, about the ethical requirement. Maybe more analogous would be, an apartment with 3 people in it who aren't related to one another, X, Y, and Z, let's suppose. And X puts up, a picture on the wall, which, is causing suffering to Y. Now, should X take it down? So this would be analogous to the people putting up the monument, right? Presumably, yes, still ethically, I think I'm inclined to say they should take it down. If they're causing this suffering and it's sort of unjustified suffering, I think that's kind of been in the background here of whether or not this is not suffering you should cause somebody, then X should take it down. But then it's a separate question of whether or not Z, who's not putting up the image, right, should take it down. And that's kind of the question I think we're asking, right? Should society, people who aren't putting up the monuments, necessarily take down the monuments, right? And we might have different answers depending on who we're talking about. Maybe those people shouldn't put up those monuments because of the unjustified suffering it might cause. And so they should take it down because of the unjustified suffering it might cause. But it's a separate question of whether or not other individuals in this situation should tolerate, right? We're kind of back to Ava's point that we're kind of talking about standards of tolerance. So I don't know what anyone's thinking is on that, but
yeah, I mean, so I don't the roommate case. Okay, if we're roommates and you put up a picture I don't like, does the mere fact that I'm irritated by it, well, like, how easily irritated am I? I mean, so you do have to wonder if I'm just too easily irritated. Is this just a power play for you not to get to decorate your walls at all? And then I get to replace it with the pictures like that I like, but and you're just more easygoing. So it isn't like a slam dunk that just because I'm irritated by it that you have the presumption is that you should take it down. But more, I think, importantly, is that this is why I think the monuments discussion cannot take place. Is not orthogonal to the question of who's in and who's out, right? There has to be this question about, well, what, are you nationalist? Are you cosmopolitan? What's going on here, right? So, are we roommates in America? Is that what a nation is? Roommates? Like, oh, damn it, we're stuck here together. This is the best I could do. I'm stuck with you. You're stuck with me. We're stuck voting
how you
on
view
the same
roommates,
people.
Dan?
Like, is that what we want to be? Now maybe that's what we become. And if so, like, the future does not look good. I don't think that sort of relationship lasts, okay? Because people will just move out. And sooner or later, you're going to start deliberately putting up those offensive things just to get me out. And so, so if it's just like a group of people I'm stuck with, you know what? I want to put up the offensive stuff to get them irritated enough to separate from me, so I could actually put up stuff I want. Right? So, because I'll tell you what I'd rather have. I'd rather have a place where I could put up stuff I want that speaks to me, than live in a place where I can't, just to have, because I'm stuck with someone who doesn't want to be with me. Right. So, that's why for me, like, for me to care at all about what you have to say about my monuments or about my decorations, I have to want to be with you. And the only people I'm going to listen to are the people who I want to be with. Right. And so it's just bizarre to me that we're, would even like the people who, like, why would I even consider taking down a monument or a decoration because of the complaints of someone who I don't even want to be with? So I had to move in my mind to saying, well, I'm just going to, like, worrying about the people who I do want to be with, right? What would be this, and that's why I hold this tribal loyalty standard.
Thanks, Dan. I should have noted too, I didn't do a good job explaining. It wasn't meant to be necessarily an objection to your view. I was sort of just taking your analogy. In fact, I'm kind of curious to know how Travis would answer it, but Chloe has her hand up, so I'm going to move to Chloe here.
Hi, yeah, so I was just kind of, the first thing that kind of popped in my head is like, kind of going off of like the legal question, like just simply answering like, should we remove racist monuments? Something that popped in my head was like, well, is this racist monument a hate crime? Like, is it really like, is it more offending somebody or is it putting them in danger? And I'm not saying like, oh, one's good or bad, but I think it's like an important question when thinking about taking something down like that.
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit unless Brenna wanted to, but it is a good question. To constitute hate crime, though, it would have to meet the bar of being a crime, right? And there are pretty strict legal criteria for that. For instance, vandalism is a crime. If the monument is not an act of vandalism, it might be hate, but it might not be a hate crime in that particular case. Or, if it's a true threat, that it would constitute a crime. I don't know if Dan and Travis have other responses to that.
No, I agree with that. I understand the term hate crime to be illegal term. So whether it would constitute a hate crime would depend upon the legal definition, and I don't think it would on any of them for the reasons that you gave. But that's not to say it's not hateful or immoral in some other context, even if it doesn't classify or technically as a legal hate crime.
Yeah, maybe like hate speech. But again, like if you are on Twitter, you could find like amazing variety of things that people consider hate speech. You know, so you know, I've been to a lot of EDI trainings. I go to EDI trainings that I don't have to go to. I just like knowing how people think and how the culture is going. And you know, so like I hear all sorts of just normal everyday terms being talked about as if they're hate speech, and I don't think they're hate speech. So you know, again, I think we're trying to settle as a culture and diverging, and I don't know whether we'll meet about like some sort of common standard about, you know, what's hateful language and what's not. Is, you know, so like, you know, calling, you know, using the word Negro today would that be hate speech? It wasn't hate speech, obviously, 60 years ago. Is using the word black hate speech? It was kind of like a lot of people were trying to tell you not to use the word black, that you should use African American. Now African American has kind of gone away. Now it's gone back to black or black. Then you hear the term black bodies, and it's like you know, I think that's bizarre. But a lot of people, you know, were using black bodies like as a better way, you know. So there's a lot of euphemism treadmill going on with terminology, language that I'm Gen X, but you know, language that we used regularly as kids is now, you know, widely viewed as offensive, like the R word, which, you know, Gen Xers used all time. But if you're 20 years old, you just, you know, you never heard anyone use that term. So yeah, you know, and definitely if they've inscribed anything on the statues, then you would say, oh, well, you know, they inscribed the word Negro on the statue. And so it's like, that's hate speech. So it could get very interesting.
Any
If
other
I
questions?
just add the definition of Wisconsin's definition of hate crime was put in the chat by Ava. So I think that echoes what you were saying. I mean, it's just, unless there's an argument to be made that the monuments are themselves illegal, it wouldn't even be able to meet those criteria in virtue of not being a crime. There was one historian that argued that Confederate monuments like violate a clause of the 14th Amendment, I want to say. I don't know what to make of that argument. It doesn't seem to have a lot of traction among historians. But I'm not like a legal scholar, so I couldn't confidently weigh in on how to interpret the law in any of these sorts of cases beyond just sort of appealing to consensus among experts. But the consensus among experts seems to be largely with that one outlier, that Confederate monuments are not illegal. And then if they're not illegal, that would preclude meeting the legal criterion for being a hate crime.
Great. Any other questions for Dan or Travis? Yeah, Brenna.
I guess I was just gonna ask, when we're talking about this debate as it relates to like freedom of expression, and we talk about how like you shouldn't stop people from being able to express different sides, even if that side is morally incorrect, in order to be able to debate what's right and wrong and keep that like open to be able to keep talking about how we prevent these things from happening in the future and things like that.
Yeah, were you suggesting that was a reason to preserve them because it sparks this sort of debate?
Yeah, or like, is it important to preserve them for that reason, or is that kind of irrelevant when talking about this stuff?
Well, I'm curious to hear what Dan thinks. I mean, I question, is it important to preserve them for that reason, for me hinges on the extent to which these monuments spark that sort of debate. And I'm antecedently skeptical that it does spark a lot of productive discussion, unfortunately. And that's just because the topic has become so polarized. And the more polarized the topic becomes, of course, the harder it is to have productive discussions where you make progress. At least, typically as you see them play out in the public sphere, there's many exceptions to that, of course. And now I'm going to be a shill for philosophy, but I wish philosophy were taught in primary schools, because one of the things that I value about philosophy so much was that it not only gave me the analytical tools to be able to subject, arguments to scrutiny, but also gave me the ability, in a way that I didn't have before, to have these conversations about difficult topics in a way that was productive. So like, if that's what would happen from leaving these up, I would agree that that would count, in favor of preserving them. But I'm just sort of skeptical that that's in fact what would happen, given how polarizing it is and how quickly debate seems to break down over these.
Right. So I do not. I myself. It's a good question. I myself do not think that free speech plays any positive role in keeping monuments up at all. Like, I don't think that's what monuments are about. They're not. Yeah. So it's not speech. I mean, it's not an individual speech. I guess on the collective, like, I mean, if you review like the country as a person writ large, like a monument could be an expression of a people. And I think peoples have a prima facie right to express themselves together in the form of monuments. Yeah, so I mean in that way, but not in any sort of free speech way, is in any liberal way that is focused on individuals. That said, I think also that it would be very bad for monuments to spark discussions. Like, that's not what I love discussions. I love arguments and all that sort of stuff, but that's not what monuments should be about. Like, when I hang a picture of grandma up, I do not want it to spark a discussion and controversy and fruitful debate in the family. That's like, I would choose a different picture of grandma that doesn't do that. Their purpose is not that. But there are other reasons to have free speech other than just causing debate, and it is. And I think, in some attenuated sense, yes. I mean, I value expression of individuals, and it isn't always to spark conversation. So I think this beautiful thing, I want to say this. I want to make this poem, and I'm not trying to spark discussion. I'm just trying to make a beautiful poem, right? Good. That's a reason for free speech. And insofar as the people collectively have a right to express themselves and their spirit, I think that it's good for them to be able to do so. And insofar as, like, you have all these rules about, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that, the more rules that you have on a people for what they can't express, that's costly to them. Now, again, those costs may be worth it. It may be, that apartment that you're sharing with people in New York City, you just got such a good deal on that room. It may be worth it to just sort of like not put up your stuff, because it's like really close to where you work, and it's really cheap, and so it's worth it to take a cut on how much you express yourself in order to live with these, in order to live in that space. But I think what we all want is ideally to be able to live in a space where we do get to fully express ourselves. And as countries get bigger, and as they get more diverse, and as people get more and more easily offended and so forth, our ability to express ourselves freely goes down. And then you have to think about, well, are the costs, is that cost worth whatever benefits that that's coming with it? And at some point, people crack and say no. This again goes to my concern about taking down the monuments, right? I mean, like, well, there are considerations weighing against that.
Ellen, I see your hand is up. You have a question, or is it accidental?
No, this is not accidental. Being a baby boomer, my concern, and I don't know if this is other people's concern, if we're going to start restricting a lot of things we can't say or put up, are we losing history? Don't we learn things from history? If it's bad or good, I just feel that we're erasing history. And we learn a lot of things from history. And I know some people get offended by things, but let's look at it as we're learning. We're learning to not be prejudicial, not, let's try to be friendly with everyone. And I really believe in free speech since I work in the Menard Center for Civil Liberties. So I'm just wondering if other people don't feel we're losing something by getting rid of things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say briefly, I do think it'd be bad if we forget history. Not only perhaps because of its effects on welfare, but you might think that knowledge is valuable in and of itself, and that there's something regrettable about the loss of knowledge, even if it doesn't make a difference to welfare. I'm not sure what I think about that at the end of the day, but that's a reasonable view to hold. The thing about monuments, as I was understanding them, was that they are, uh, as I was thinking of them at least, like not just a descriptive account of some historical event, but involve some element of honor. And I was, because of your concern that you raised, would want the removal of any monument that could result in a loss of historical knowledge to be supplemented with something else, so we don't avoid that. Now, that said, your question made me think of one recent example that maybe is some cause for concern. So outside of the Museum of Natural History in New York, there used to be a statue of Teddy Roosevelt on a horse with two Native Americans by his side. And that was perceived, rightly or wrongly, as trying to elevate him above Native Americans. And he had expressed racist beliefs when he was alive. So initially, the museum put up a plaque, and I'd go there and see it. So I saw it before, and then I saw this like long plaque that they put up that sort of explained a little bit about who he was and made it clear that this was more of a descriptive account and that the artist didn't mean to portray him as being elevated above non-whites and so on. And that seemed to actually, as far as I could tell, satisfy people, because there ceased to be protests outside of the monument, at least that I would see. There was very little press coverage of it. And then the next press coverage I got was when they just removed it altogether. That didn't satisfy someone, or at least the people of the museum that were in charge of deciding whether to keep it out there was worried that it wouldn't satisfy people. And then it just ended up being removed, even after it had already been converted into this like explicitly not endorsing any of his moral shortcomings, and really meant to just sort of offer this kind of historical background. So I think, anyway, that's a long rambling answer to say that your point about the value of history is well taken.
Yeah, it's I think I'm glad Travis brought up that particular monument. So, Ellen, that's a great question. Here's what your opponents would say, Ellen. Well, why not put up a statue to Hitler? Because Hitler was really important historically, and if we're worried about history, then we should have like Hitler statues up, right? In like the National Mall, right? Because it was like the person historically that we fought against and so forth. But no one wants to do that. That's what Travis is getting to with the honor. That there is this honoring aspect to monuments. And another thing Travis has pointed out, and it's apt, that monuments also kind of distort history. So like if you're interested in monuments for historical reasons, then are you worried about them for portraying, do you want them to portray history accurately? In which case, okay, now, is that really what monuments are for? So I think there is, for my part, I think there is a historical element to history, to monuments, where you put them front and center to help these figures be familiar to your people. It is important to say, like, if I were teaching Hume, I'd be like, Hume, I mean, the guy that you pass by on the way to class, and, you see the statue, or we're sitting here in Hume Hall, or what, like, I mean, all that stuff is meaningful to help people know they're embedded in this in this big tradition. And monuments do distort history, and I think they should, right? So, like, when I'm not putting up like unflattering pictures of my family on the walls, right? We usually put up flattering. Everyone has their nice cardigan sweater and they're shaved or whatever. They're not in their wife beater T-shirt. You portray history in a flattering way for your people. Their propaganda, right? It's positive propaganda. It's supposed to build a sense of tribe and a sense of so it distorts history, but it is historical, and I think that's good. So yeah, I think all that stuff is going on in monuments, and I do think if they're just gone, if we just live in a shopping mall, then every figure that has been very transformative to our culture, and of people who sometimes made great sacrifices for us, is as unfamiliar as someone who was, from the other side of the world. And I don't think that's right. I think they should be familiar names. And it would help us understand the history for them to be familiar names and familiar faces to us. And likewise, looking at, sure, you could look in some ancestry.com and learn about your grandma, like she's a stranger, but you're going to have a lot more connection with her if you saw the picture on the wall growing up. And so, yeah, I think that's all wrapped in there.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I especially want to thank Dan and Travis. It was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I wish we could go for another hour. But thanks everyone for coming, and hopefully I'll see you at some future events. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Zan. Thank you, Travis. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.